The Galactic Council chamber fell into stunned silence as the holographic display flickered to life, revealing a blue marble suspended in the vast darkness of space. Ambassador Zywandhar's chromatic scale shifted through shades of deep purple, a color his species reserved for profound disbelief. He had served the Galactic Union for 3 centuries, had catalogued thousands of worlds, had witnessed the birth of stars and the collapse of civilizations, yet nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for this moment. The data scrolling across his neural interface couldn't possibly be correct. It had to be some kind of error, a glitch in the survey systems, perhaps even a deliberate fabrication designed to test the Council's credulity. But the readings had been verified 17 times by independent observers from 7 different species, each using their own scanning technology, each arriving at the same impossible conclusion. Earth. That was what the humans called their homeworld. Terra, to those who preferred the classical designation. The third planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star and what the inhabitants charmingly referred to as the Milky Way galaxy. For 2 standard cycles, the Galactic Union had been aware of humanity's existence, had monitored their primitive radio transmissions with the detached curiosity typically reserved for pre-contact civilizations. They seemed pleasant enough, these humans, with their chaotic creativity and their curious tendency to anthropomorphize everything from their mechanical constructs to the very storms that ravaged their world. The Union's first contact protocols had been carefully prepared, the diplomatic vessels were being readied, and the cultural liaison teams had spent months studying human art, music, and literature in preparation for that momentous introduction to the greater galactic community. It was supposed to be routine, just another emerging species taking their first tentative steps into the cosmic arena, another addition to the grand tapestry of civilized worlds. Then the planetary classification report arrived, and everything changed. The xenobiologist who first processed the data reportedly suffered a complete nervous collapse and had to be sedated for 3 days. His supervisor, a being of legendary composure who had surveyed Deathworlds across the spiral arm, took one look at the findings and immediately requested an emergency session of the full council. Because Earth, that serene blue world with its swirling white clouds and its single oversized moon, wasn't just a Deathworld. It was a Class 13 death world, a category so extreme that most council members had assumed it was purely theoretical, a mathematical boundary that no world with complex life could actually achieve. The classification system itself only went up to 15, and those final 2 categories existed solely to describe worlds actively trying to kill everything on their surface through volcanic apocalypse or gravitational anomalies that would liquefy most known biological structures. Ambassador Zywandhar's tentacles trembled slightly as he expanded the atmospheric composition data across the central display. Oxygen. 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. The council chamber erupted into alarmed chittering and subsonic rumbles of distress. Oxygen, that violently reactive element, that corrosive poison that degraded cellular structures and caused catastrophic combustion events. Most civilized worlds maintained oxygen levels below 8%, carefully controlled within sealed environmental systems, and even the hardiest species known to the Union couldn't survive prolonged exposure above 12% without suffering severe tissue damage. Yet here was a world where oxygen made up more than 1/5 of the entire atmosphere, where every breath was a controlled burn, where the very air was slowly oxidizing everything it touched. The humans didn't just tolerate this toxic environment, they had evolved within it, had adapted to harness its destructive potential to fuel their cellular processes with an efficiency that bordered on the obscene. But the atmospheric composition was merely the beginning of Earth's horrors. Zywandhar advanced to the geological data, and the council members who had begun to recover from the previous shock fell silent once more. The planet's crust was fractured into massive tectonic plates that ground against each other with inexorable force, creating zones of catastrophic seismic activity that could level entire cities in moments. Volcanic systems dotted the surface, capable of erupting with such violence that they could alter global climate patterns for years. The magnetic field fluctuated and occasionally reversed entirely, bombarding the surface with radiation that would sterilize most worlds. And the gravity, sweet cosmic mercy, the gravity registered at 1.3 standard units, meaning that humans lived their entire lives under a crushing weight that would leave most species unable to stand, their bones compressing under the relentless downward pull. Every day of their existence was equivalent to wearing a heavy gravity training suit that could never be removed. The weather patterns made several council members excuse themselves from the chamber entirely. Earth possessed a hydrological cycle of staggering violence, where massive storm systems could generate wind speeds exceeding 200 km per hour, where frozen precipitation fell from the sky in chunks capable of causing blunt force trauma, where electrical discharges of billions of volts arced between the clouds and the ground in displays that could be seen from orbit. Hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, droughts, floods. The humans had names for dozens of different ways their weather tried to kill them, and they discussed these phenomena with the casual familiarity one might use to describe mildly inconvenient traffic patterns. They built their settlements directly in the paths of these recurring catastrophes, then simply rebuilt when the inevitable destruction occurred, displaying a persistence that struck the council as bordering on madness. The true horror, however, revealed itself when the xenobiology teams compiled their reports on Earth's biosphere. Senior researcher Calvara, whose compound eyes had witnessed the strangest lifeforms across 3 galactic quadrants, stood before the council with her wings folded in a posture that her species reserved for mourning the dead. Her voice, typically steady and clinical, wavered as she began her presentation. The biodiversity index of Earth exceeded every known threshold for sustainable planetary ecosystems by factors that seemed to mock the established laws of evolutionary biology. Millions of species, each locked in an eternal struggle for survival, each evolved to kill or to avoid being killed, all crammed together on a single world in a seething mass of predation, parasitism, and competition that would have collapsed into extinction events on any rational planet. Yet Earth's biosphere had not collapsed. It had thrived for billions of years, growing ever more complex, ever more dangerous, ever more absurdly inventive in the ways life found to propagate itself. The megafauna alone would have been sufficient to classify Earth as hostile to civilization. Creatures weighing several tons roamed the land masses, their bodies optimized for violence through eons of evolutionary pressure. The humans called them elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotami, bears, and big cats, names that sounded almost whimsical until one examined the casualty reports. A single swipe from a creature called a grizzly bear could decapitate a human with casual ease, yet humans encountered these animals regularly and considered the meetings noteworthy but hardly unprecedented. The oceans harbored even worse nightmares, predators that could grow to 30 meters in length, with teeth the size of a human hand and bite forces measured in tons per square inch. Great white sharks, orcas, saltwater crocodiles. The humans swam in the same waters as these apex predators, intentionally, often for recreation. They called it courage, but the council recognized it as the casual acceptance of mortality that only a Deathworld species could possess. Then there were the microorganisms, and this was where researcher Calvara's composure finally broke completely. Her wings began to flutter in uncontrolled distress as she displayed the scanning data from Earth's microbial ecosystem. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites, prion. Microscopic horrors that invaded human bodies and consumed them from within, that hijacked cellular processes to replicate themselves, that evolved resistance to countermeasures faster than defensive systems could adapt. Diseases that liquefied organs, that caused flesh to necrotize and die while the host still lived, that crossed the blood-brain barrier and consumed neural tissue until consciousness itself dissolved into fever-dream madness. The humans called them plagues, pandemics, epidemics, and they had lived with these invisible killers for their entire evolutionary history, their immune systems locked in an eternal arms race with pathogens that would have sterilized any civilized world within a standard year. And yet they persisted, they adapted, they developed medicine and vaccination and public health protocols with the same grim determination they applied to every other existential threat their world presented. The council learned that human children, actual juvenile humans still undergoing development, were exposed to a curated selection of weakened pathogens to train their immune systems for the battles ahead. They injected their young with modified viruses as a matter of routine medical care, a practice that sounded like child abuse to species who had eradicated disease through environmental control and genetic stabilization. But humans couldn't control their environment, couldn't stabilize the genetic chaos of their biosphere, so they had evolved internal warfare as a survival strategy. Every human body was a battlefield where trillions of beneficial microorganisms fought against invading pathogens in a microscopic conflict that never ended, not even in sleep, not even in death. They were walking ecosystems, each one a complex symbiosis of human cells and bacterial colonizers that would have horrified any species that valued biological purity. Ambassador Zyndar found himself transfixed by the psychological profiles that accompanied the biological data. The humans knew about all of these threats, had quantified them, studied them, created entire fields of scientific inquiry dedicated to understanding the countless ways their world could kill them. And yet they experienced something they called love for their planet, spoke of its beauty with genuine emotion, created art celebrating its terrifying majesty. They formed emotional attachments to the very predators that occasionally ate them, established conservation programs to protect species that killed dozens of humans annually, and wept when these dangerous creatures faced extinction from habitat loss. It was a cognitive dissonance that the Council's psychologists struggled to categorize. These humans had survived their world not by conquering it, not by sterilizing it into submission, but by accepting it, by finding meaning and purpose in the struggle itself, by transforming survival into a form of defiant joy. The data streams continued to flow across Zyndar's neural interface, each new revelation more disturbing than the last. Humans could survive without food for weeks, without water for days, could lose substantial percentages of their blood volume and continue functioning, could endure temperature extremes that would send most species into hibernation or death. Their bodies possessed redundant systems, backup processes, emergency protocols that activated under stress. They could voluntarily override their own survival instincts through sheer determination, could force their bodies past the point of safe operation through nothing more than willpower and the peculiar human conviction that giving up was somehow worse than death itself. They ran until their muscles tore, fought until their bones broke, and then they kept going because something in their psychology simply refused to accept defeat. What truly disturbed the Galactic Council, what kept Ambassador Zyndar awake through 3 consecutive rest cycles, was not the catalogue of horrors that Earth presented, but rather how humans had responded to those horrors. The cultural database painted a picture of a species that should have been hardened into brutality, that should have developed a society based purely on survival of the strongest, that should have become monsters to match the monstrous world that had forged them. Instead, the surveillance data revealed something the Council had no framework to understand. Humans had created art, music, literature, philosophy. They had developed complex ethical systems, had built civilizations founded on concepts like justice, compassion, and the radical notion that the strong had an obligation to protect the weak. They had invented the idea of rights, of dignity, of the inherent value of conscious beings regardless of their utility or strength. The recordings from Earth's information networks showed a species engaged in constant debate about morality, about their responsibilities to each other, to their world, to the future generations who would inherit whatever remained after their stewardship. They argued passionately about abstract concepts like fairness and equality while living on a planet that embodied neither principle in its fundamental operations. They created social structures designed to care for their injured, their elderly, their vulnerable, investing enormous resources into keeping alive individuals who could no longer contribute to the species' survival in any practical sense. It was evolutionary madness, a waste of energy that should have been eliminated by natural selection, yet they defended these practices with a ferocity that exceeded their response to physical threats. Attack a human and they might flee or fight back with rational self-preservation, but attack the idea that their grandmother deserved medical care and dignity in her final years, and they would burn down civilizations to defend that principle. The historical records revealed that humans had indeed known brutality, had created empires built on conquest and subjugation, had committed atrocities that rivaled anything the galaxy's worst species had achieved. But they had also created the concept of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, of universal human rights that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. They had looked at their own worst impulses and decided collectively that certain lines should never be crossed, then built international institutions designed to enforce those boundaries even when enforcement contradicted immediate self-interest. They had survived their death world not by becoming as merciless as their environment, but by consciously choosing to be better than the circumstances that created them, by insisting that survival wasn't enough if it came at the cost of what made survival meaningful. Their literature was filled with stories of sacrifice, of individuals who gave their lives to save strangers, who stepped into danger to protect the innocent, who chose death over compromise with evil. The Council's anthropologists initially dismissed these narratives as fictional idealization, the kind of propaganda every society created to encourage prosocial behavior. Then the incident reports started arriving, documenting actual events, verified by multiple independent sources, of humans who had done exactly what their stories described. Parents who threw themselves between their children in danger, firefighters who entered burning structures to rescue people they had never met, soldiers who covered grenades with their own bodies to protect their companions, activists who faced imprisonment and death to defend principles they believed transcended their individual existence. These weren't aberrations or rare exceptions. They happened with sufficient frequency that humans had developed awards and commemorations for such acts, had institutionalized the recognition of self-sacrifice as one of their culture's highest virtues. Ambassador Zyndar found himself reviewing the footage of a human rescue operation following one of their routine natural disasters, an earthquake that had reduced an urban center to rubble within minutes. The response was coordinated chaos, thousands of humans converging on the disaster site with equipment and supplies, digging through the wreckage with their bare hands when machinery couldn't reach trapped survivors. They worked for days without rest, ignoring their own exhaustion and injury, pulling victims from the debris and immediately returning to search for more. Some of those rescuers died in secondary collapses, crushed by the same concrete and steel they were trying to move, yet others immediately took their places without hesitation. The survivor accounts described rescuers speaking words of comfort through the rubble, promising the trapped victims that they wouldn't be abandoned, that help was coming, that they mattered enough for strangers to risk death to save them. And the humans kept that promise, against all rational calculation of risk versus reward. The medical data revealed something the council's physicians found almost impossible to believe until they verified it through multiple independent scans. Humans produced a neurochemical response to altruistic behavior, to helping others without expectation of reciprocation, that activated the same reward centers in their brains as food, reproduction, and other survival-critical activities. Their evolution on a Deathworld had somehow wired their neurology to derive pleasure from cooperation, from empathy, from the success of their group even at personal cost. They had turned tribal bonding, that basic survival strategy common to social species, into something transcendent, something that extended beyond kinship groups in genetic similarity to encompass the entire species and even beyond. They formed emotional connections with non-human animals, with their pets and companions, grieving their deaths with genuine anguish that registered on psychological scans as identical to the loss of human family members. The council members from predator species found this particularly baffling, while the prey species representatives felt an uncomfortable kinship with these strange Deathworlders. But even the prey species civilizations, those who had evolved cooperation and herd dynamics into sophisticated social structures, couldn't match the peculiar human capacity for what they called compassion. Humans didn't just cooperate for mutual benefit within defined social boundaries. They extended moral consideration to beings who could offer them nothing in return, created organizations dedicated to reducing suffering in species that weren't even sentient, and engaged in heated ethical debates about their obligations to hypothetical beings that didn't yet exist and might never exist. They worried about the rights of artificial intelligences they hadn't created yet, about the welfare of ecosystems on planets they would never visit, about the heat death of the universe trillions of years in their species' future. The decision to proceed with first contact protocols was not made lightly, and the debate consumed the council for nearly a full standard cycle. One faction argued that humanity should be contained, their world quarantined until the Galactic Union could assess the threat they represented. Not because humans had demonstrated aggression toward other species, they hadn't even achieved faster-than-light travel yet, but because everything about them violated the established understanding of how civilized species should develop. They were anomalies, evolutionary impossibilities that had somehow bootstrapped themselves into consciousness and culture despite originating from a world that should have produced nothing but apex predators locked in eternal conflict. The opposition faction, led by Ambassador Zyndar himself, insisted that the Union's founding principles demanded engagement, that fear of the unknown was unworthy of beings who had united hundreds of species under a banner of mutual cooperation and understanding. If the Union withdrew from its stated values at the first encounter with something truly alien, then those values had never meant anything in the first place. The compromise reached was characteristically bureaucratic and ultimately meaningless in the face of what actually transpired. A small diplomatic vessel would make contact, would share limited information about the Galactic Union, and would extend an invitation for cultural and scientific exchange while carefully assessing humanity's readiness for full integration into the galactic community. The ship arrived in Earth's solar system with all due ceremony, broadcasting greetings in the mathematical languages the Union had developed for first contact scenarios, prepared to begin the careful process of introducing a primitive species to the wonders and responsibilities of galactic citizenship. They had done this hundreds of times before with species who possessed far more advanced technology than humanity's crude chemical rockets and electromagnetic communications. The protocol was refined, tested, reliable. It should have been routine. Captain Telvoris, who commanded the diplomatic vessel, later reported that his first indication something was wrong came when his communications officer detected multiple active tracking systems locked onto their ship before they had even finished their initial greeting. The humans had been watching, had detected the ship's approach with their primitive sensor arrays, and had immediately mobilized what appeared to be their entire military command structure in response. Within hours, not days or weeks but hours, the humans had established a dedicated first contact task force, had assembled teams of scientists and diplomats, and had responded with a formal message that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the political and social implications of contact with an advanced alien civilization. They didn't panic, didn't assume hostile intent, but they also didn't relax their vigilance or allow wonder to override their survival instincts. They approached the moment that should have been the pinnacle of their species' history with cautious optimism tempered by the same pragmatic threat assessment they applied to everything else their dangerous universe presented. The first face-to-face meeting occurred at a location the humans designated, in a facility they controlled, with security protocols that made several of the Union delegates uncomfortable with their implications of contingency planning for hostile scenarios. The human representatives arrived precisely on time, neither early enough to suggest anxiety nor late enough to imply disrespect, moving with a controlled grace that Captain Telvoris recognized from species evolved under high gravity. They wore what his cultural database identified as formal attire, carefully neutral and designed to avoid unintended symbolic communications, and they greeted their visitors with the complex protocols that human cultures had developed for diplomatic encounters between historically hostile nations. Every gesture was calculated, every word chosen with precision, and beneath the surface politeness lay an awareness of power dynamics and strategic positioning that belonged to species with centuries more experience in interstellar politics. The lead human diplomat introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, and she spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had spent her entire career preparing for a moment she had never truly believed would arrive. Her opening statement, which Captain Telvoris preserved in its entirety in his official report, set a tone that would define all subsequent human-Union interactions. She thanked the Galactic Union for making contact, expressed humanity's eagerness to learn and to contribute to the broader galactic community, and then pivoted with startling directness to address what she called the elephant in the room, an idiom that required several minutes of cross-cultural explanation. Dr. Chen stated, with no trace of embarrassment or defensiveness, that humanity was aware their world was unusually hostile by the standards of most civilizations, that they understood their evolution had equipped them with capabilities and psychological traits that might seem extreme or even disturbing to species from more forgiving environments, and that they hoped the Union would judge them not by the harsh circumstances of their origin but by the choices they had made in spite of those circumstances. The statement landed with considerable impact because it demonstrated that humans had already reached the same conclusions about their world that had required the Council months of analysis and debate to articulate. They knew they were different, knew they came from a Deathworld, and rather than hiding that fact or pretending to be something they weren't, they had chosen to acknowledge it directly and to frame the conversation on their own terms. Captain Telvoris found himself revising his assessment of humanity's technological primitiveness. They might not have mastered faster-than-light travel, but they had clearly mastered the art of diplomatic positioning, and they possessed a self-awareness that many older species lacked. The humans had looked at themselves through alien eyes and accepted what they saw without flinching, had owned their nature rather than apologizing for it, and had extended an implicit challenge to the Union to respond with the same honesty and courage. The integration of humanity into the Galactic Union proceeded in fits and starts, marked by moments of profound cultural exchange and occasional spectacular misunderstandings that required delicate diplomatic intervention to resolve. Humans took to space with the same reckless enthusiasm they applied to every other dangerous environment they encountered, treating the vacuum of space as simply another hostile ecosystem to adapt to and ultimately master. Their engineering solutions horrified Union safety inspectors with their tolerance for risk and their apparent philosophy that redundant backup systems were luxuries rather than necessities, yet somehow their vessels continued to function, held together by what human engineers called optimism and what Union observers recognized as an intimate familiarity with operating equipment at the margins of acceptable performance parameters. When a human mining ship suffered catastrophic system failures in the asteroid belt and limped back to port on emergency power with half the crew injured and the ship's hull breached in 3 locations, the crews celebrated their survival with an enthusiasm that baffled their alien counterparts, who would have filed incident reports and trauma counseling requests. The military implications of humanity's Deathworld origin became apparent when the first joint training exercises were conducted between Union peacekeeping forces and human volunteers. The humans, who had been carefully briefed on appropriate force levels and had promised to adjust their responses to account for the relative fragility of other species, still managed to send a dozen Union soldiers to medical facilities with injuries ranging from minor contusions to fractured exoskeletons. The problem wasn't malicious intent or failure to follow protocols. The problem was that human definitions of acceptable physical contact, of proportional response, of safe training intensity, had been calibrated on a world where everything was trying to kill them, and they genuinely couldn't conceive of how gentle they needed to be until after someone got hurt. A human instructor demonstrating unarmed combat techniques at what she considered minimal intensity had accidentally broken a Verdanian lieutenant's primary manipulator appendage with a training hold that her nervous system registered as barely applying any pressure at all. The apologies were profuse and sincere, but the incident report's conclusion was inescapable: humans were dangerous even when they were trying desperately not to be. Yet the cultural exchange flowed in both directions, and the Galactic Union found itself enriched in unexpected ways by humanity's presence. Human art began to circulate through galactic networks, carrying with it an emotional intensity that species from stable, peaceful worlds found simultaneously disturbing and compelling. Music that had been composed in response to human suffering, to loss and grief and the terrible beauty of their violent world, resonated with beings who had never experienced such extremes of emotion but found themselves moved nonetheless. Human literature explored themes of struggle and redemption, of meaning found in adversity, of the choice to remain compassionate in a universe that offered no guarantee of justice or fairness. These were not novel concepts to the Union's philosophers and artists, but humans approached them with a visceral authenticity that came from lived experience rather than abstract contemplation. They knew suffering not as a thought experiment but as a fact of existence, and they had chosen to respond with creativity rather than despair. The xenopsychologists studying human integration discovered something remarkable in the broader patterns of human behavior within the Union. Humans gravitated toward the difficult problems, the dangerous assignments, the roles that other species avoided because the risk exceeded the reward by any rational calculation. They volunteered for disaster relief operations on worlds suffering from natural catastrophes, bringing with them an expertise in crisis response that had been hard-won on their own disaster-prone planet. They excelled in roles requiring rapid adaptation to unexpected threats, in situations where careful planning gave way to improvisation under pressure, in the chaotic margins where established protocols broke down and someone needed to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information. They weren't fearless, the psychological scans made that clear, but they had learned to function effectively while afraid, to acknowledge terror and then act anyway because the alternative was surrender, and surrender was simply not part of their psychological makeup. Ambassador Zyandar stood once again before the council chamber, 3 standard years after that first shocking planetary classification report, preparing to deliver his assessment of humanity's integration into the Galactic Union. His chromatic scales had shifted to a deep blue, the color his species used to indicate profound respect, and his voice carried none of the disbelief that had characterized his earlier presentations. He spoke of a species that had indeed originated from a Class 13 Deathworld, that carried all the scars and strengths such an origin implied, but that had chosen to direct those strengths toward construction rather than destruction, toward protection rather than conquest, toward expanding the definition of civilization rather than conforming to existing templates. Humans were dangerous, he acknowledged freely, but they were dangerous in the way that a rescue worker was dangerous, possessing capabilities for violence and endurance that they chose to employ in service of something larger than their individual or even species survival. The galaxy, Zyandar concluded, had grown comfortable in its long peace, had forgotten what it meant to struggle against existential threats, had built its civilizations on worlds that demanded little and offered much. Humanity reminded the Union that consciousness itself was a defiant act, that every thinking being was an impossibility that had clawed its way into existence against entropy's patient grind toward equilibrium. Earth had not made humans weak through its cruelty. It had made them strong, had forged them into beings who could endure anything because they had evolved enduring everything, and they had emerged from that crucible with their compassion intact, with their capacity for wonder undimmed, with their insistence that life meant something beyond mere survival. The Galactic Union was better for their presence, he stated with absolute conviction, not despite their origin from a death world, but because of it, because they brought with them a reminder that the universe was vast and terrible and beautiful, and that choosing to face it with courage and kindness was the only response worthy of consciousness itself. The council chamber erupted in approval, members from 100 worlds signaling their agreement in a symphony of alien gestures, and humanity's place among the stars was secured, not through conquest or intimidation, but through the simple power of being exactly what they were, survivors who had never forgotten how to hope.